Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into what it actually meant to be cut open in the Middle Ages, not by a butcher, not by a torturer, but by the most respected medical professionals of their day. And somehow, that's worse. Because butchers don't pretend. A butcher knows what he's doing to the animal on the table. The medieval surgeon, on the other hand, leaned over his patient with a steady hand, a sharp knife, a head full of theories that were almost entirely wrong, and the absolute conviction that he was helping. He was educated. He was licensed, sometimes. He had read the books that mattered. He knew the names of the four humors, the phases of the moon, the planets that governed each organ, and then he picked up a tool that had not been cleaned since the last patient, and he went to work. That's the part that stays with you. Not the pain, not the blood, the certainty. Tonight, we're walking through 12 corners of medieval surgery. The rooms, the tools, the men, and the very rare women who held the knives. We'll meet a French boy who in one sleepless night accidentally discovered that pouring boiling oil into a wound might not be the best idea. We'll meet an English surgeon who pulled an arrowhead out of a future king's face and somehow didn't kill him. We'll watch a patient sit upright, fully awake, and watch a needle move toward his own eye. We'll learn what was in the cup the patient drank before surgery and why drinking it was sometimes more dangerous than the surgery itself. And we'll find out what the red and white pole outside the barber shop on your street is actually advertising. Spoiler, it's not haircuts. We'll move slowly through all of it. There's no rush tonight. The Middle Ages didn't rush, and neither will we. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this, a quick like helps a lot. And if you actually like what I do here, consider subscribing. No pressure, but it does mean the algorithm stops yelling at me. Drop a comment, too. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I love seeing who's up late with me around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe open a window or turn on a fan for that soft background noise, and let's ease into tonight's story together. Imagine for a moment that you are not in your bed. You are in a stone room somewhere in northern France in the year 1340. The walls are cold. The floor is colder. There's a single candle burning on a wooden table, and the smoke from it curls slowly toward a low ceiling that has seen this exact scene 100 times before. You can smell tallow. You can smell iron. You can smell something faint and herbal underneath, rosemary maybe, or wormwood, scattered across the floor to keep the worst of the air at bay. There is a chair in the center of the room. Someone is sitting in it. They are very still. Their hands are tied gently to the armrests, not cruelly, just so they cannot move when the moment comes. A man in dark wool stands behind them, holding their forehead with the patient firmness of someone who has done this 100 times. Another man stands in front of them, washing his hands in a bowl of water that has already been used twice today. He is not a butcher. He is not a torturer. He is the most respected surgeon in the city. And in his right hand, polished by years of careful use, is a small, hand-cranked drill. So, before he begins, let's go back to the room behind the room, back to the question almost no one thinks to ask. Who, exactly, was this man? And why, of all the people in medieval Europe, was he the one allowed to touch the inside of your skull? The man washing his hands in the bowl of dirty water has a name. We don't always know it. Most medieval surgeons worked and died in obscurity, their patients listed in parish records, their own names absent from history. But the role he plays in this room, in this moment, is centuries older than he is, older than the city, older than France,
older than almost anything you'd recognize. To understand what he is about to do, you have to understand who he is. And who he is, in the strict logic of medieval Europe, is a craftsman, not a doctor, not even close. Medieval medicine had a class system, and it was rigid in a way modern medicine simply isn't. At the top sat the physician, the university-trained scholar who had spent years reading Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, and Aristotle in Latin. He could diagnose, he could prescribe, he could lecture, he could collect a fee. What he absolutely would not do, under any circumstance, was touch you. Manual labor was beneath him. Cutting, draining, sewing, setting bones, these were tasks for hands rougher than his. The physician's job was to think. The thinking was the dignity. The body was someone else's problem. Below the physician sat the surgeon, and this is the man in the room with you tonight. He usually trained through apprenticeship rather than university. He read books sometimes, but he read them the way a carpenter reads a plan, as a guide for the hands.
He could close a wound. He could remove a stone. He could amputate a limb. What he could not do, in most of medieval Europe, was call himself a doctor. Call himself a doctor, and the physicians would have him in court before sundown. Below the surgeon sat the barber-surgeon, and we'll meet him properly in a few chapters. He cut hair, pulled teeth, drained boils, and on his bigger days performed light surgeries for villages that had no one else. And there was a reason this hierarchy existed. In 1163, at the Council of Tours, the Church issued a phrase that would shape European medicine for the next 400 years. Ecclesia abhorret a sanguine. The Church abhors blood. Clergy, who until then had performed much of Europe's surgery inside monastery walls, were forbidden from cutting human flesh. The work didn't disappear, it just fell. Down from the educated monks into the hands of laymen, then further down into the hands of barbers who already had the sharpest blades in town and steady enough hands to use them on a face.
The surgeon, then, was the middle of the ladder, respected enough to be called for serious work, despised enough to be reminded constantly that he was not a real doctor. A surgeon could cut, a surgeon could cauterize, a surgeon could amputate. What he could not do was call himself a doctor. And yet, by the late medieval years, the surgeon was beginning to push back. In 1306, a Frenchman named Henri de Mondeville started writing a surgical text in which he argued, gently but firmly, that surgery was a noble art, that working with one's hands on the human body was not a disgrace, but a calling. He died before he finished it. 60 years later, another Frenchman named Guy de Chauliac picked up the project and produced the Chirurgia Magna, the Great Surgery, which became the standard surgical textbook for the next 200 years. If the man in your room tonight has read any book at all, it is probably this one. So that is who is washing his hands: a craftsman, a reader, a man trained by a master who was trained by a master who was trained by someone who, 4 generations ago, was trained by a barber. He is, by the standards of his time, the best you can hope for, and he is about to drill a hole in your skull. The procedure he is about to perform is called trepanation, and it is the oldest surgery on earth. This is the part most people don't believe when they first hear it. Trepanation predates written history, predates the wheel, predates agriculture in some regions. Archaeologists have pulled Neolithic skulls out of the ground, 7,000 and 8,000 years old, with neat circular holes in them, and around the edges of those holes, the bone has healed. The patient lived, sometimes for years, sometimes long enough to be trepanned a second time. There are skulls with 3, 4, even 5 healed openings. From today's view, this looks like prehistoric butchery. From their view, it was the most sophisticated medical intervention available, a way to release something trapped inside the head.
And that's what's so chilling. Because the medieval surgeon, drilling into a skull in 1340, was performing essentially the same procedure as a Neolithic healer in 5000 BC. The tools had changed, the reasons had changed, the technique had barely moved. Why would anyone do this? The medieval reasons were a strange mix of the reasonable and the deeply, painfully wrong. Reasonable. Head trauma. A man takes a hammer to the temple in a tavern brawl. His skull cracks, the brain swells, pressure builds inside the head, and the man begins to lose consciousness, then the use of his limbs, then his ability to speak. A medieval surgeon with no understanding of brain swelling, but a great deal of practical experience watching such men die, knew that drilling a hole could sometimes relieve the pressure and bring the man back. He couldn't tell you why, he just knew that it worked often enough.
Less reasonable, epilepsy. The medieval mind understood seizures as the result of something inside the head that needed to come out. A demon, perhaps, a bad humor, a stagnant fluid. The cure, naturally, was to open a door for it to leave through. Even less reasonable, melancholy. Depression, in the medieval sense, was a buildup of black bile in the head. Drill hole, drain the bile, lift the mood. There is a famous painting by Hieronymus Bosch, The Extraction of the Stone of Madness, that depicts exactly this idea. A surgeon stands behind a seated patient, cutting into the top of his head, while a priest and a nun look on. The stone being extracted is not a stone at all. It is the imagined source of the patient's mental illness. Bosch painted it as satire. The audience of his time recognized it as satire. They also kept doing it. And least reasonable of all, chronic headache. If you went to a medieval surgeon with a headache that would not go away, and you had the money, and he had the time, the trepan was an option that was politely offered and occasionally accepted. People agreed to this. They sat in the chair. They let him drill. Because in a world without aspirin, without ibuprofen, without any concept of vascular tension or migraine, the only theory available was that something inside the head wanted out, and the only way to let something out was to open a door. The tool itself was almost beautiful in the way that old surgical instruments often are. The medieval trepan was a hand-cranked drill, no larger than a fist, with a circular crown of teeth at the business end and a small center pin to keep the bit from skating across the bone. The surgeon would shave a small patch of the patient's scalp, cut a flap of skin and pull it back, expose the bone, and then begin to turn the crank. Slowly, very slowly. The crown of teeth would carve a circle into the skull, deeper and deeper, while the surgeon paused every few rotations to brush away the bone dust and check his depth. The goal was to cut through the bone, but not through what was underneath it. Beneath the skull lies the dura mater, a tough membrane that protects the brain itself, and beneath that, the brain itself. A surgeon who pushed too hard, too fast, would punch through the dura and into the brain itself, and the patient would not survive the night. A surgeon who pushed gently, carefully, could lift out a small disc of bone, about the size of a coin, and leave the dura intact, glistening, alive, beating with the patient's pulse. And then he would cover it with a poultice, a patch of cloth soaked in egg white, or honey, or wine, or whatever the local tradition recommended. He would lay the flap of skin back over the opening, he would wrap the head, and he would tell the patient to rest. The astonishing part, the part that makes trepanation so different from almost every other medieval procedure, is that survival rates were not catastrophic. Modern studies of medieval and early modern trepan skulls show healing rates that suggest somewhere between half and 2/3 of patients survived the operation itself. Not the underlying illness necessarily, but the surgery. They lived. The bone grew back, slowly, around the edges of the hole, leaving a permanent crater that you can still see in skeletons pulled from medieval cemeteries today.
From today's view, this looks like a slow-motion massacre with a hand-cranked drill. From their view, it was one of the few surgeries that actually had a fighting chance of working. And that's what's so chilling. There is a quiet, almost comic irony to all of this. The medieval surgeon, hated by physicians, looked down on by scholars, considered too low to call himself a doctor, was performing one of the only procedures in his entire era that had any real evidence behind it. The physician, with his books and his Latin and his planetary charts, would prescribe leeches and astrology and dried beetle powder. The surgeon, with his cranked drill and his bowl of dirty water, would relieve pressure on a swollen brain, and the patient would walk out of the room. If medieval medicine had a leaderboard, the surgeon would not have been at the bottom. He would have been near the top, quietly, without anyone willing to admit it. But here, again, the chilling part. The surgeon didn't know why it worked. He couldn't have told you in any meaningful sense what the brain was. He thought it was the seat of phlegm, or the cooling chamber for the blood, or the source of cold and damp humors that needed balancing against the hot and dry humors of the heart. He drilled holes in heads for the wrong reasons, with the wrong theories, and got results that were sometimes correct anyway. Like a man who builds a bridge using only superstition, and somehow, the bridge holds. He cleaned the bowl. He wiped the drill on a rag. He set the small disc of bone aside. Sometimes the patient asked to keep it as a kind of charm, and the surgeon would let them. He extinguished the candle. He went home. And tomorrow, somewhere else in the city, he would do it again. But not every medieval surgeon worked in a quiet stone room with a chair and a candle. Some of them worked in tents. Some of them worked in mud. Some of them worked while arrows were still falling and the patients on the table were kings. The mud came first. Before the screaming, before the smell, before the surgeons even reached the field, there was the mud. It was the kind of mud only a medieval battlefield could produce. Earth churned to soup by 10,000 boots, soaked with rain, soaked with blood, soaked with the slow leaking ruin of horses that had fallen and not gotten back up. You did not walk through it, you waded. The surgeon waded too. He carried a leather satchel slung over one shoulder, and inside it was the entire world he had to work with. A few iron probes, a roll of linen, a small saw, a curved needle, a coil of waxed thread, a jar of honey, a flask of wine, a cautery iron wrapped in cloth, and, if he was lucky and had remembered, a small pot of opium paste that had cost him more than he wanted to admit. That was it. That was the medieval field hospital. There was no tent waiting for him. There was no clean table. There was no assistant. There was only the satchel and the surgeon and the men lying in the mud who were at that moment dividing themselves into 3 categories without knowing it. The first category was the dead. The surgeon walked past them. The second category was the dying. The surgeon, if he was honest with himself, also walked past. Abdominal wounds, wounds to the great vessels of the neck or thigh, wounds to the chest that bubbled when the man breathed. There was nothing he could do for these men, except the small mercy of a sip of wine and a hand on the shoulder. He gave it when he could. He kept moving. The third category was the savable. Limbs, surface wounds, arrows in places where arrows could come out. These were the men who got the satchel. This was triage 600 years before the word existed. The medieval battlefield surgeon did not have the language for it, but he had the practice. He had learned it from his master, who had learned it from his master, who probably learned it on a crusade somewhere in the Levant, watching Islamic physicians work with a calm efficiency that Europe, frankly, did not yet possess. And the longer the surgeon worked, the more the categories shifted. A man who looked savable in the first hour might become dying by the third. A man passed over as dying might, against every expectation, still be breathing at dawn, and now he was savable, and the surgeon, exhausted, would kneel back down in the mud and start again. A surgeon could close a wound. A surgeon could cauterize a stump. A surgeon could not stop a man from dying of something he could not see, and what they could not see, mostly, was infection. The wound that looked clean tonight would be hot tomorrow, smelling by the day after, black by the end of the week. The medieval battlefield surgeon's deepest enemy was not the arrow or the sword. It was the slow, invisible thing that arrived 3 days later and could not be cut out. We'll come back to that enemy properly in Chapter 7. Tonight, though, we are in a particular tent on a particular night in the year 1403, and the patient on the table is 16 years old, and his name is Henry of Monmouth. The English will eventually call him Henry V. The French, soon enough, will call him something less polite. But on this night, in this tent, he is just Hal, a teenage prince, and there is an arrow in his face.
The Battle of Shrewsbury had been fought that day, on July 21st, between the armies of King Henry IV and the rebel Henry Hotspur Percy. The fighting was savage, even by the standards of the time. At some point during the chaos, an arrow, fired by an unknown longbowman, possibly Welsh, possibly one of Hotspur's own men, had struck Prince Hal in the face. It had entered just to the left of his nose, beneath the eye. It had driven through the bone of his cheek, past the roof of his mouth, and lodged itself 6 inches deep in the back of his skull, against the bone at the rear of his head. The shaft of the arrow had been broken off in the field. What remained was the iron head, bodkin-tipped, designed to punch through armor, sitting deep inside the skull of the heir to the English throne. Several surgeons had already tried. They had reached into the wound with their fingers, with hooks, with probes. They had pulled. The arrowhead had not moved. It was wedged. It had bone above it, bone below it, and it had been driven so deep that there was no leverage to be had. Some of the surgeons recommended leaving it in place and praying. Others recommended cutting deeper, opening the wound wider, and trying to lever it out, a procedure that would almost certainly kill the prince. The king sent for John Bradmore. Bradmore was not a famous man at the time. He was a London surgeon, middle of the ladder, exactly the kind of craftsman we met in Chapter 1. He had a workshop, he had patients. He had also at one point been imprisoned for counterfeiting coins, which is a detail history likes to mention because it complicates the heroic version of the story. Whatever his past, he was known in London for 2 things: his skill with metal and his refusal to give up on a patient other surgeons had abandoned. He arrived at the prince's bedside and looked at the wound. He listened to the other surgeons describe what they had tried. He examined the angle of the arrow. He felt gently around the entry hole, and then he did something that almost no medieval surgeon would have thought to do. He went home to his workshop and he built a tool. The tool was a kind of slim metal tongs. The tips were fine and tapered like the legs of a delicate spider. Down the center of the tongs ran a screw. The idea was simple, almost embarrassingly clever. Insert the closed tongs into the wound, push them gently into the hollow socket of the arrowhead, then turn the screw. As the screw tightened, the tips of the tongs would spread apart inside the socket, gripping the arrowhead from the inside out.
Once the grip was firm, the whole tool, with the arrowhead attached, could be pulled cleanly back the way it had come. He tested it on a piece of wood. Then he tested it on a fresh piece of meat from a butcher with an arrowhead embedded inside. Then he packed it in a roll of linen and walked back to the prince. What happened next was almost certainly the longest hour of medieval surgical history.
Bradmore first widened the wound. He used what he called tenths, small probes wrapped in linen and soaked in honey, which he inserted into the arrow channel, and then exchanged, day by day, for slightly larger ones. The wound channel had to be widened gradually, gently, without tearing. This part of the procedure took several days. Then, when the channel was wide enough, he slid the tongs in, slowly, carefully. The prince was awake. The prince was probably given wine and possibly opium. Bradmore's own surviving notes do not specify, but there was no real anesthesia. There was only the 16-year-old's grip on the arms of the chair, and the surgeon's voice, calm and steady, asking him to hold still just a little longer. The tongs reached the back of the wound. Bradmore felt the tips of them slip into the socket of the arrowhead. He turned the screw. He felt the grip tighten. He waited a moment. He pulled. The arrowhead came free. Bradmore washed the wound with white wine. He packed it with linen soaked in a salve of his own making, barley flour, honey, turpentine, and a few other ingredients he carefully recorded in his Latin treatise, Philomena. He kept the dressing open and draining for 20 days, replacing the packing with gradually smaller tenths so that the channel could heal from the bottom up rather than sealing over an infected pocket. The prince lived. Not just lived, recovered. He kept the scar on his face for the rest of his life, and 12 years later, at Agincourt in 1415, this same young man, now a king, would lead the most famous English victory of the medieval era, with a scar on his cheek that John Bradmore had given him, the way a tailor leaves a single stitch behind in a coat he has saved. From today's view, the story sounds like a miracle. From their view, Bradmore's view, the prince's view, the king's view, it was simply good work, careful work, the kind of work that the physicians of the era could not have done because they refused to touch the body, and the kind of work the barbers could not have done because they did not have the imagination to invent a tool. It was the surgeon's moment, the middle-of-the-ladder craftsman, doing the thing that no one else could. And that, too, is what's so chilling, because for every Bradmore, there were 100 surgeons in tents along 100 other battlefields who did not have the skill, the tools, or the time. Their patients died in the mud. Their names did not survive. The arrowheads that killed them were left where they were, and the bodies were buried in trenches, and history did not write any of it down. Bradmore wrote his story down. That is the only reason we are telling it tonight. The satchel came home with him. The tongs went back on the workshop shelf. He died in 1412, 3 years before Agincourt, never knowing what his patient would become. But not every wound on a medieval battlefield could be saved with a clever tool. Sometimes the limb was too far gone. Sometimes the bone was shattered beyond repair. Sometimes the only thing the surgeon could do was reach into the satchel and pull out the saw. The saw came out of the satchel last, always last, because the moment the surgeon reached for it, every man in the tent, the patient, the assistants, the priest in the corner, if there was one, knew that the other options had been used up. The probes had failed. The poultices had failed. The wound had gone past the point where it could be coaxed back to life. There was rot in the limb now,
or splintered bone where bone should not be, or a spread of black skin moving slowly toward the heart. The saw was not the first answer. The saw was the last answer. And medieval surgery had a great deal of last answers. The tool itself was crude in a way that is hard to describe without sounding cruel about it. The medieval bone saw was made of iron, sometimes steel, with coarse triangular teeth that looked more suited to a carpenter's bench than a human leg. The handle was wood, often plain, sometimes carved by the surgeon himself for grip. It was not always cleaned between patients. It was not always sharpened between battles. It was simply the saw, and when it came out, it had a job to do, and the job was finished as quickly as the surgeon's arm could move. Speed was the only kindness available. That phrase is going to come back several times tonight, because it is the central truth of medieval surgery before anesthesia. There was no putting the patient under. There was no slow, careful operation with time to think and reposition. There was only the awake patient, the assistants holding him down, and the surgeon's commitment to finishing the cut before the patient's body finished what shock and pain were already trying to do. Let's walk through it, slowly enough that you understand it, quickly enough that we do not linger. The patient is laid on a low table, or sometimes on the floor. If the surgeon is in a town, the table is wood, scrubbed clean by an assistant. If he is on a battlefield, the table is whatever flat surface can be found, a door pulled off its hinges, a butcher's block borrowed from the village, a wooden chest emptied of its contents. The patient is given a leather strap to bite on. He is given wine. If he is fortunate and the surgeon is generous, he is given a small cup of something stronger, opium, mandrake, a sleeping draught we will return to in Chapter 8. But generosity in a field hospital was a rare currency.
4 men are needed, 1 at each shoulder, holding the arms down, 1 across the chest, leaning his weight on the patient's torso so the body cannot arch up off the table, 1 at the opposite leg, holding it still so the patient cannot kick. The limb to be cut, the bad leg, the ruined arm, is held by the surgeon's own assistant, who lifts it slightly, supporting the weight, exposing the line where the cut will go. A leather strap goes around the limb above the cut. This is the tourniquet. The surgeon tightens it himself, twisting the buckle until the muscle beneath it bulges and the blood vessels are squeezed shut. The patient feels this. The patient feels everything. There is no part of the procedure he is permitted to be absent from. The surgeon picks up his knife first, not the saw. The knife, a long, slightly curved blade, sharper than anything in the satchel, kept sharp specifically for this. He uses it to make a single circular cut around the limb, slicing through the skin and the muscle in one continuous motion, going as deep as he can in a single pass. He does not stop. He does not pause to check the patient's face. The cut takes seconds. Done well, it can be done in one breath. Then the saw. He sets the teeth against the bone. He pulls. The first stroke is the loudest. The second is faster. By the third, he has found his rhythm, and the rhythm is the only thing in the room that matters. The bone gives way in less than a minute, sometimes less than 30 seconds, in the hands of the best surgeons in Europe. The limb falls away. An assistant catches it before it hits the floor. And then comes the worst part. Worse somehow than the cut, worse somehow than the saw. The stump is open, blood vessels are exposed. The leather tourniquet has held back most of it, but not all, and when the tourniquet is loosened, and it has to be loosened because the limb cannot be left choked off forever,
the bleeding will begin in earnest. There are two ways in the medieval kit to stop it. The first way is fire. A cautery iron, heated in the brazier until the tip glows orange, is pressed directly to the open vessels and the raw face of the stump. The flesh hisses. The smell, and this is the detail that has made every soldier and every surgeon's apprentice flinch from the moment fire was used this way, is the smell of cooking meat layered with the iron tang of blood, layered with the smoke of singed wool from the dressings nearby. It is a smell that does not leave the room for a week. It does not leave the surgeon's clothes for longer. The second way is boiling oil. Elder oil, traditionally, heated until it bubbled, then poured directly into the wound. We will come back to this method in Chapter 9, because it is the one that a young French boy, 3 centuries from now, will accidentally discover should never have been done in the first place. But for tonight, in 1340, in 1380, in 1420, in every field tent where a man has just lost a leg, the oil and the iron are the 2 doors out of bleeding to death. The surgeon picks one. He does it fast. He does it without looking at the patient's face.
And then, the dressing. Linen, often soaked in egg white or honey, packed against the stump and bound tight. The patient is given more wine. The assistants step back. The surgeon wipes his hands on a rag. If the patient survives the next hour, the hour of shock, the hour of the body trying to understand what has just been taken from it, he has a real chance. Not a guarantee. The infection is still coming, the fever is still coming, but the worst minute is behind him, and the worst minute is the one most patients did not survive. Survival rates for medieval amputation are difficult to pin down precisely because the records were kept badly when they were kept at all. The best modern estimates, drawn from monastic infirmary records and a handful of military chroniclers, suggest something in the range of 50% in skilled hands, in clean conditions, on a healthy patient. In field conditions, in mud, in summer, on a man already weakened by blood loss, the number dropped sharply, sometimes catastrophically. And yet, men agreed to it. They asked for it. Because the alternative, leaving the leg, leaving the arm, leaving the rot to climb upward toward the body, was a slower death and a more certain one. Amputation was a coin flip. Doing nothing was a closing door. There is a quieter horror in the aftermath. Phantom limb pain, the sensation that the missing arm or leg is still there, still hurting, still itching in places that no longer exist, was recorded in medieval surgical texts as a kind of haunting. Patients reported that the absent foot ached in the cold, that the missing hand could feel a pulse. The surgeons of the time had no neurological explanation for this. They wrote it as a spiritual residue, a piece of the soul lingering where the body had been. From today's view, we know it is the brain still mapping a limb that no longer exists. From their view, it was a ghost in the bed. And that too is what's so chilling. Not because they were wrong, because they were describing something real with the only language they had. The amputee, if he lived, would carry the wound for the rest of his life. There were no prosthetics worth speaking of in the early Middle Ages. By the late medieval period, the wooden leg had emerged as a craft of its own, strapped on with leather, hollowed for weight, sometimes carved to look almost human. Crusader knights returned to Europe with such legs by the dozen. Battlefield veterans of the 100 Years' War lined the streets of London and Paris with them, begging or working what trades they could. The surgeon who had taken the limb would not see most of these men again. He had moved on. Another tent, another saw, another rag, another quiet ride home. But of all the wounds the medieval surgeon faced, amputation was at least a problem he could see. There was another kind of medical horror that the medieval world faced wide-eyed and conscious. And unlike the limb, this one could not be cut away. It could only be reached for, slowly, with a tool no thicker than a knitting needle, while the patient sat upright and watched. The needle is for the eye. We will get to the eye. But before the needle, there was another tool, just as slim, just as cruel, and used on a part of the body the patient could neither see nor reach. And the surgeon who wielded it was sometimes the most famous man in town, and sometimes the most hated, and quite often both at once. His name, in the trade, was the lithotomist, the stone cutter. He was the man who removed bladder stones from living, conscious patients, and he did it in under a minute. The good ones, anyway. The bad ones took longer, and their patients did not always survive long enough to complain about the difference. Bladder stones were one of the great miseries of medieval Europe. The combination of a diet heavy in salted meat, weak beer instead of water, almost no fresh fruit through the winter, and chronic dehydration created the perfect chemistry inside the human bladder for stones to grow, slowly, painfully, sometimes to the size of a small hen's egg. Adult men suffered most. Children suffered second most. By the time a stone reached the size where it could be felt as a constant grinding pain in the lower abdomen, the patient was usually willing to do whatever was necessary to be rid of it. And what was necessary was, by any standard, a great deal. The procedure had a long lineage. The Greek physician Hippocrates, in the 5th century BC, had specifically forbidden his followers from performing it. "I will not cut even for the stone," runs the line in the original Hippocratic oath, but will leave such procedures to the practitioners of that craft. The craft, in other words, was already a separate profession in 400 BC. By the time of the Roman encyclopedist Aulus Cornelius Celsus in the 1st century AD, Celsus's instructions, astonishingly, were still being followed almost word for word in medieval Europe 1,000 years later. The Andalusian surgeon Al-Zarawi, known in Latin Europe as Albucasis, refined the procedure further in his great medical encyclopedia, Kitab al-Tasrif, in the 10th century. His writings reached Europe through Latin translation in the 12th century and became part of the standard surgical curriculum. So the man holding the knife in 1340 was not improvising. He was performing a procedure with a 1,500-year pedigree. That was the comfort he could offer. It was, in honesty, the only comfort he could offer. Let's go into the room. The patient is naked from the waist down. He has been instructed to fast for a day. He has been given wine, sometimes opium. He is laid on his back on a low table. His knees are pulled up toward his chest. His ankles are tied to his wrists, or to a strap around his neck, holding him in a folded position that exposes the perineum, the small patch of skin between the anus and the genitals, to the surgeon's hands. This position has a name in modern medicine. It is called the lithotomy position. It is still used today in operating rooms across the world for procedures that have nothing to do with stones. The name has outlived the reason for it by 800 years. 4 men hold the patient down. The surgeon kneels in front of him. He inserts 2 fingers into the patient's rectum. He uses them to feel through the wall of the rectum for the stone inside the bladder. Once he has it, he pushes it gently downward and forward until it is pressing against the wall of the perineum from the inside. Now he can feel it from the outside with his other hand as a hard lump under the skin. He picks up the knife. He makes a single cut, short, deep, angled to one side of the midline, through the perineum and into the wall of the bladder itself. The patient feels this. The patient, in fact, feels everything from this moment until the end. There is no cushion of unconsciousness. There is no mercy of distance. There is only the surgeon, the cut, the blood, and the slow understanding that the worst thing has not yet happened. Then comes the tool. It was called in medieval Latin manuals the duckbill, a long, narrow, hinged extractor with a curved beak at the end. The surgeon slid it into the incision, opened the beak inside the bladder, gripped the stone, and pulled it out through the wound he had just made. If the stone was small and round, this was quick. If it was large or jagged or wedged against the bladder wall, the surgeon had to maneuver, and every second of maneuvering was a second of agony for the patient that no amount of wine could blunt. The fastest lithotomists in Europe could complete the entire procedure from first cut to extracted stone in less than a minute. 60 seconds. That was the gold standard. That was the difference, in many cases, between a patient who survived and a patient who did not. Speed was the only kindness available. The most famous lithotomist of the early modern era, and we are bending a few decades past the strictly medieval here, but the technique is the same, was a French itinerant surgeon named Frère Jacques Beaulieu, who traveled across France and Italy in the late 1600s, performing lithotomies in town squares, monasteries, and the homes of the wealthy. He was not a trained physician. He wasn't even technically a friar. He wore the robes for the gravitas, and because they made it harder for local authorities to chase him out of town. He performed thousands of lithotomies in his career. His survival rate was, by some accounts, around 50%. By others, considerably worse. He kept moving. The towns he had already visited were not always friendly to him on a return trip. The patient who survived the cut was not yet safe. The wound in the perineum was left open to drain, sometimes for weeks. Infection was the constant enemy. Fistulas, where the wound failed to heal cleanly and a permanent leak developed between the bladder and the outside of the body, were a common complication. Many men who survived the surgery itself died of the infection that followed. Many more lived, but lived as invalids, leaking, embarrassed, marked for the rest of their lives by a procedure that had supposedly saved them. And yet they kept agreeing to it, because the alternative, living with the stone, feeling it grow, feeling it block the flow of urine until the bladder ruptured, was not a life. It was a slow countdown. The most famous patient in the history of bladder stone surgery was the English diarist Samuel Pepys, who underwent a lithotomy in 1658 at the age of 25. The stone removed from his bladder, by his own description, was the size of a tennis ball. Pepys survived. He lived another 45 years. He kept the stone in a velvet-lined box on a shelf in his study, and every year, on the anniversary of his surgery, March 26th, he held a small private dinner to celebrate the day he had not died. He called it his stone feast. His friends were invited. The stone was placed on the table. That is the medieval relationship to surgery in a single image. A man sitting at a polite dinner with the thing that had nearly killed him on the table between the candles and the wine. Not in horror, in gratitude. From today's view, this looks grotesque. From their view, it was the most rational thing in the world. He had been spared. The stone was the proof. And that, too, is what's so chilling. The surgeon, of course, was not at the dinner. He had moved on. Another town, another patient, another 60 seconds in which a life was either saved or ended. But not every medieval surgery was a race to be finished before the patient could understand what was happening. Some were performed slowly, with a hand that could not afford to shake, on a part of the body that the patient could see, and worse, on a part of the body the patient could not look away from, because the patient was sitting upright. The patient was awake, and the patient was watching the needle move toward his own eye. There is a particular kind of horror that belongs to surgeries the patient can see. The amputation is brutal, but the patient is looking away, looking up, looking anywhere but the limb. The lithotomy is worse, but the geometry of the body keeps the eyes pointed at the ceiling. Couching the eye is different. Couching the eye is the surgery you watch. The patient sits upright in a low chair. He is not strapped down. He is not held by 4 men. There is no need for any of that, because the procedure depends on stillness. Total, voluntary, absolute stillness. And a thrashing patient is a blinded patient. So instead, the surgeon talks, quietly, steadily. He places one hand on the side of the patient's face, fingers spread along the temple, thumb resting gently on the cheekbone. And with that single light pressure, he tells the patient, without words, that he must not move. In the surgeon's other hand is a needle, long, slim, sometimes bronze, sometimes silver, sometimes simple iron, polished until it caught the light. The needle was the entire procedure. The needle is what the patient watches as it comes toward the corner of his own eye. The surgery had a name in the Latin manuals, reclinatio, the reclining or laying down of the lens. In English, it became couching, from the same root as the French coucher, to lay down to sleep. The surgeon was not removing the cataract. He could not remove the cataract. He had no tools fine enough, no understanding of the lens precise enough, no anesthesia steady enough to allow him to. What he could do was push the cloudy lens out of the way. The needle entered through the white of the eye, just to the side of the iris. The surgeon advanced it slowly into the chamber of the eye itself, until the tip rested against the lens. Then, with the lightest possible pressure, he pressed downward and inward, breaking the small ligaments that held the lens in place and tipping it backward into the empty cavity at the rear of the eye. The lens, now floating loose and out of the line of sight, was no longer between the patient and the world. For a few seconds, and this is the part that made couching survive for 2,000 years despite its terrible long-term outcomes, the patient could see. Light, at least. Color sometimes. Movement. The face of the surgeon. The shape of a window. After years, sometimes decades of advancing blindness, the patient sat up and could perceive the world again. There was usually weeping. There was sometimes laughter. The surgeon collected his fee and left town. What the patient did not yet know was that the sight he had just been given was a temporary loan made on terms he had not been told. The procedure had ancient roots. The earliest known description appears in the Sushruta Samhita, the great Indian surgical text attributed to Sushruta, written somewhere between 600 and 300 BC. Sushruta described the technique in detail, the position of the patient, the angle of the needle, the moment of pressure on the lens. He even described the post-operative care. Warm butter applied to the eye, the patient kept in a darkened room for 7 days, the head wrapped to prevent movement. The Indian surgical tradition carried the procedure forward for centuries before it traveled westward, through Persia and the Islamic world, into the medical libraries of the medieval West. The Andalusian master al-Zahrawi, the same surgeon we met in the last chapter, the author of the Kitab al-Tasrif, refined the technique further in 10th century Cordoba. He added the use of a hollow needle for certain cases, an early ancestor of suction-based cataract surgery that would not be properly developed for another 800 years. His descriptions reached medieval Europe in Latin translation in the 12th century, and from that point on, couching was part of the surgical curriculum at every university with a medical faculty. The Arab physician Ammar ibn Ali al-Mawsili, working in 10th century Iraq, wrote one of the most detailed surviving accounts of cataract surgery in his treatise, The Choice of Eye Diseases. He claimed to have performed the procedure successfully on patients in Egypt and Syria. His instruments, preserved in description though not in metal, were finer than anything Europe had at the time. In medieval Europe, the procedure became the specialty of a particular kind of traveling surgeon, the oculist. He was not a university man. He did not, generally, hold a license. He moved from town to town with a small leather case of needles and a reputation that preceded him by a few days. He performed the surgery in inns, in churches, sometimes in the open air of a market square, with the patient sitting on a stool and a small crowd watching. He charged what the family could pay. He left, almost always, before the long-term complications arrived. And the long-term complications were severe. The lens, displaced into the back of the eye, was a foreign body floating loose in fluid. It often triggered chronic inflammation. It often slid back, partially, into the line of sight. It almost always raised the pressure inside the eye, and that rising pressure caused a slow secondary blindness that we now call glaucoma. The patient who had wept with joy at seeing the surgeon's face would, within months or years, often lose his sight again, and this time permanently. This time with no needle that could give it back. Infection was the other killer. Any breach of the eye, made with a needle that had not been properly cleaned and inserted into a chamber that the surgeon could not see into, was an open invitation. Endophthalmitis, infection inside the eye itself, could blind the patient within days and, in severe cases, kill them within weeks. The oculist, if he was an honest one, would have warned the family. Most were not honest ones. Most were already in the next town when the symptoms began. The most famous oculist of the early modern era, and we are bending forward in time again, but the technique was identical to the medieval one, was an Englishman named John Taylor, who styled himself the Chevalier and toured Europe in the 18th century with a horse-drawn carriage painted with eyes. He was charismatic, eloquent, and almost certainly a fraud. He performed couching on royalty and on commoners alike, demanded payment in advance, and was on the road again before the bandages came off. 2 of his patients are remembered today, not for their surgeries, but for what they composed afterward. Johann Sebastian Bach was couched by Taylor in 1750 and went completely blind shortly afterward. He died a few months later, the cause of death debated, but the surgery is widely considered to have hastened it. George Friedrich Handel, 9 years later, was operated on by the same Taylor, with the same result: total blindness. Bach, Handel, 2 of the towering figures of European music, blinded by the same man, with the same needle, using a technique that had not changed meaningfully in 2,000 years. From today's view, this looks like a scandal. From their view, it was the standard of care. There was no other option. Either you sat in the chair and watched the needle, or you spent the rest of your life watching nothing at all. And that, too, is what's so chilling. Not that the procedure was crude, that it was the best the world had, and the best the world had was this. The oculist packed his case, he climbed into his carriage, he flicked the reins. The patient sat in the chair, eye bandaged, waiting for the dark room and the warm butter and the 7 days of stillness. The surgeon would not be there to see whether the gift held. But not every medieval medical worker traveled in a painted carriage. Some of them stood behind a counter on a street corner, with a pole outside the door and a basin of leeches by the window. And almost everyone in town had been to see them, often more than once, often without remembering exactly why. You have walked past it 1,000 times, on a street corner in your own town almost certainly. A spinning pole, red and white, sometimes blue stripes added for American tastes, mounted outside a small shop with a glass door and a row of leather chairs behind it. You went inside, perhaps. You sat down. You asked for a haircut. You paid. You left. And in all the years you have walked past that pole, it is very likely that no one ever told you what it actually means. The pole is a memorial. The red is for blood. The white is for the bandages. The brass ball that sits at the top of the pole in the older designs, the one most modern barbershops have quietly removed because it confuses customers, is the basin, the leech basin, the bowl of blood that sat by the window of every medieval barber's workshop, ready to be carried out and used the moment a patient walked through the door. The pole itself, in some traditions, represents the staff that the patient gripped while being blooded, twisting it slowly to keep the veins of the arm engorged so the blood would flow freely. The red and white spiral was, originally, the blood-stained bandage hung out to dry, twisting in the breeze outside the shop. The barber-surgeon, the man who cut your hair, drained your boil, pulled your tooth, set your fracture, leeched your fever, lanced your eye, and, on his bigger days, took off the smaller of your fingers. He was the most accessible medical professional in medieval Europe, and for most of the population, the peasants, the laborers, the small tradesmen, the families with no money for a physician and no time to wait for a surgeon, he was the only one they would ever see. He had a particular Latin name in the medical records of the time, Barbi-tonsor, the shaver of beards. The phrase tells you exactly where on the social ladder he was understood to sit. He was a tradesman who happened to also be allowed to cut into the human body, and the order of those two things in the eyes of the law and the church mattered. He was a barber first. The surgery was an accessory. His origin story begins, of all places, in the monastery. In the early Middle Ages, much of Europe's surgery was performed inside monastic walls by monks who had inherited the medical knowledge of the late Roman world. The monks needed shaving. The tonsure, the shaved circle on the crown of the head, was a religious requirement, and so the monasteries kept resident barbers on staff. When a monk needed bloodletting or had a tooth that needed pulling or had developed a boil that needed lancing, the barber was already on the premises with the sharpest blades in the building. He helped, he learned, he watched. Then came the Council of Tours in 1163, the same council we met in Chapter 1. The church declared that clergy were forbidden from shedding blood. The monks stopped cutting. The barbers, who had been quietly assisting for generations, kept doing what they had always done. Only now, without the monk standing behind them, they were doing it alone. The work moved outside the monastery walls. It moved into the towns. It set up shop on the high street. And the pole went up outside the door. By the late 13th century, the barber-surgeon was a recognized profession across Europe, with guilds, apprenticeships, and a strict separation from the more elevated company of pure surgeons. In Paris, the College of St. Côme, founded around 1210, represented the long-robed surgeons who considered themselves a class apart from the short-robed barbers. The two groups feuded centuries. The pure surgeons regarded the barbers as semi-literate butchers operating with no theoretical understanding of the body. The barbers regarded the pure surgeons as expensive snobs who would not lower themselves to do the work the public actually needed. Both, of course, were partly correct. In England, the barbers were organized as the Worshipful Company of Barbers. founded in 1308 under Richard the Barber, who served as the first official master of the barbers of London. The pure surgeons had their own smaller, separate guild. The two operated in uneasy parallel for over 2 centuries, until King Henry VIII, in 1540, signed the act that merged them into a single body, the Company of Barbers and Surgeons of London. The signing was so significant that Hans Holbein the Younger was commissioned to paint it. The painting still survives. Henry VIII seated on his throne, handing the charter to a kneeling row of barbers and surgeons. It hangs today in the Hall of the Worshipful Company of Barbers in London, a single canvas that captures the moment medieval medicine officially admitted that the man who cut your hair and the man who cut into your body were, legally, the same profession. The merger came with rules. Barbers could shave, cut hair, pull teeth, and let blood. Surgeons could perform the deeper procedures, the amputations, the trepanations, the major work. Neither was allowed to call themselves a physician. The hierarchy held. Imagine your local hairdresser also pulled your teeth, drained your boils, and on Tuesdays performed minor amputations. Now imagine they were the good option. That is the medieval barber-surgeon. Not because he was bad at his work, many of them were, by the standards of their time, genuinely skilled, but because the alternatives were either unaffordable or unavailable. The physician would not see you. The pure surgeon was 3 towns away and charged a noble's fee. The barber was on the corner. The pole was spinning. He had a chair open. You went inside. The work he did was, in many ways, the work that kept medieval towns alive. Tooth extraction was performed daily, pulled with a tool called the pelican, a hooked iron lever that resembled the bird it was named after. Bloodletting was the constant, the bread and butter of the trade. The barber kept a calendar on the wall showing which days of the lunar month were considered safe for bleeding which veins. He kept a chart of the body, divided into regions, showing where the blood should be drawn for which complaint. He kept a set of small bronze fleams, folding lancets, in a leather case in his apron pocket, ready to be opened and used at any time.
He kept leeches, a jar of them, sometimes 2, by the window, where the light could keep them sluggish. He fed them on scraps. He named some of them, the older barbers did, in a quiet kind of professional intimacy that no other medieval craftsman shared with his tools. And he kept records, not always written, often kept only in memory. But every barber-surgeon of any standing knew the medical history of half the town, who bled well and who bled poorly, who fainted at the lancet and who did not, who had a tooth on the left side that was about to go, and who had been quietly developing a swelling under the jaw for the past month. He was, in the truest sense, the family doctor of the medieval poor. And one of his apprentices, a young man who began his career quite literally sweeping up the hair on a barber's floor, would become the most important surgeon of the 16th century. His name was Ambroise Paré, and we will meet him properly in Chapter 9, on the night he ran out of boiling oil and accidentally invented modern wound care. But it is worth noting here that the man who would change European surgery forever began his life on the floor of a barber's shop, holding the bowl while another man's blood was drawn into it. He was a barber-surgeon first. The history that followed grew out of that beginning. The pole spins on. The shop closes for the night. The bowl is rinsed and set on the shelf for tomorrow. The leeches are fed. The fleams are wiped on a rag and folded back into the leather case. The barber locks the door. He goes home. From today's view, the medieval barber-surgeon looks like a contradiction in terms, a tradesman pretending to be a doctor, a craftsman with delusions of medicine. But from their view, he was the medical system. He was the man you went to when something was wrong, and he was the man who, more often than the educated physicians would ever admit, actually made it better. And that, too, is what's so chilling. Not that the system was built on a barber, that the barber, in the end, was often the best of it. But for all his work, for all his fleams and leeches and quiet record-keeping, the barber could not see what was killing most of his patients.
He could not see what was killing most of every surgeon's patients, in every tent and every workshop and every monastic infirmary across the medieval world. It lived in the wound. It arrived 3 days after the cut. It had no name the medieval mind could properly hold. And the doctrine the entire profession had built around it was, from beginning to end, exactly the wrong one. The wound looked fine in the morning. That was the part the surgeon would remember in the years afterward, when he tried to understand what had happened. The cut was clean. The edges were aligned. The bleeding had stopped. The patient had eaten a small bowl of broth and asked for a second one, and the surgeon had taken that as the sign every surgeon hoped for. The man would live. By the evening, the skin around the wound was warm to the touch. By the next morning, it was hot. By the day after, it was the color of wine, and the patient could not focus his eyes, and the smell coming from beneath the dressing was a smell the surgeon recognized the way a sailor recognizes the change in the wind that means a storm has already begun somewhere far out at sea and is now simply traveling toward you. By the 3rd day, the patient was dead. This was the most common ending in medieval surgery. Not the cut itself, not the saw, not the needle in the eye or the duckbill in the bladder. The infection that arrived afterwards, invisible, slow, and absolutely certain, killed more surgical patients than every other cause combined. And the doctrine the entire medical profession had built around it was, from the 1st century AD onward, a doctrine that actively made it worse. Its name was laudable pus. The phrase in Latin was pus bonum et laudabile, good and praiseworthy pus, and it was the central theological belief of medieval wound care. The idea came from the Greek physician Galen of Pergamon, the 2nd century AD writer whose works dominated European medicine for the next 1400 years. Galen had observed that wounds which produced thick, creamy white pus often went on to heal, while wounds which produced thin, watery, bloody discharge often did not. He concluded, reasonably given his evidence, that the thick pus was a good sign. It was the body expelling corruption. It was the wound cleansing itself. It was the visible proof that the humors were doing their work. He was, in the most catastrophically possible, half right and entirely wrong. The thick white pus he was describing was, we now know, the body's response to a particular kind of bacterial infection, one that the immune system was actively containing. It was not the cause of healing. It was a sign that healing might still be possible despite the infection. The thin, watery discharge he had condemned was, we now know, often the sign of a much more dangerous infection, one the body could not contain, one that was traveling through the bloodstream, one that we today call sepsis. Galen had it exactly backwards. He had identified the survivable infections as good and the lethal ones as bad, and his conclusion had been that the survivable infections were therapeutic, that you should encourage them, that you should help them along. For the next 1400 years, that is what European medicine did. Surgeons would deliberately leave wounds open. They would pack them with materials chosen specifically to encourage suppuration. They would apply ointments, pig fat, dove dung, moldy bread, ground earthworms that were intended not to disinfect the wound, but to invite the laudable pus to appear. A wound that healed cleanly without producing pus was regarded with suspicion. The surgeon would worry. He would reopen the wound sometimes to make sure the corruption had not been driven inward where it could not escape. He was performing the medical equivalent of removing the smoke detector because the alarm meant something was wrong. And then, in the 13th century, a single voice tried to say it. His name was Hugh of Lucca, an Italian surgeon born around 1160 who had served as an army surgeon during the Fifth Crusade and had spent years working on battlefield wounds in conditions that taught him things the academics did not know. Hugh observed, in direct contradiction to Galen, that wounds kept clean and dry tended to heal better than wounds packed with ointments and encouraged to suppurate. He did not write his observations down. He taught them to his students. The most important of those students was his adopted son, Theodoric of Servia, sometimes written Theodoric Borgognoni, who became a Dominican friar, a bishop, and one of the most quietly important surgeons of the Middle Ages. Theodoric, working from his father's teachings, wrote a 4-volume surgical treatise called the Chirurgia, completed around 1267. In it, he did something almost no medieval medical writer dared to do. He directly contradicted Galen. He wrote that the production of pus was not a necessary stage of healing. He wrote that wounds should be cleaned with wine, which we now understand to have mild antiseptic properties, and then closed and kept dry. He wrote that the doctrine of laudable pus was killing patients. He was ignored. Not refuted, not argued with. Ignored. The medical schools of Europe continued teaching Galen. The surgeons in the field continued packing wounds with dove dung, and the patients continued to die at exactly the rates they had always died. Theodoric's book was copied. It was read. It was even respected in a polite sort of way. And then it was set on the shelf, and the next generation of surgeons reached for the older books instead. It would take 600 years and the work of Joseph Lister in the 1860s before European medicine officially accepted what a 13th century friar had already written down. The infections themselves had names, many names. The medieval mind, unable to see the bacterium, named the disease by what it looked like or what it felt like to the patient. St. Anthony's fire, known today as ergotism in some cases and erysipelas, a streptococcal skin infection in others, produced a burning sensation and a deep red discoloration of the skin, often on the limbs. The name came from the monastery of St. Anthony in France, where sufferers traveled in the hope of a miracle, and where the monks, without knowing why, often cured them simply by feeding them bread baked from clean grain rather than the ergot-contaminated rye of their home villages. Gangrene had 2 forms in the medieval understanding. The dry form, where the limb shriveled and turned black slowly, and the wet form, where the limb swelled, leaked, and smelled. Both meant amputation, if the surgeon had the skill and the patient had the strength. Tetanus, the rotting evil in some texts, locked the jaw and arched the back and killed within days. Sepsis itself had no medieval name, because the medieval mind had no concept of a system-wide bacterial invasion. It was simply called the fever, or the ill humor, or, in the bluntest of the surviving accounts, the death that comes after. And then there was the maggot. In the field hospitals of medieval and early modern wars, surgeons noticed something strange. Wounds left untended in summer, wounds that had not been packed with ointments because the surgeon had run out of supplies, wounds that flies had reached before the bandages did. These wounds sometimes healed better than the carefully tended ones. The flies had laid their eggs, the eggs had hatched, the maggots had eaten the dead and infected tissue while leaving the living tissue alone. The wound had cleaned itself, by accident. through the only consistent debridement system the medieval world had access to. The surgeons did not understand it. They wrote it down as a curiosity. A few of the more practical ones, especially in military medicine, began to use it deliberately, but quietly, because the practice was difficult to defend in front of the educated physicians. Maggot debridement therapy is today an FDA-approved medical treatment used in modern hospitals for chronic wounds. It was discovered, the way most medieval medicine was discovered, by accident, and then nearly lost. From today's view, the doctrine of laudable pus looks like organized self-sabotage, 1,400 years of doctors making infections worse on purpose and then writing books about how it was working. From their view, it was the careful application of the best science the world had. Galen had said so. Galen had been right about everything else. The pus was praiseworthy. The wound was healing. The patient who died of sepsis a week later had simply been too weak to begin with. The doctrine survived because it could explain its own failures. And that, too, is what's so chilling. Not that they were wrong, that the system they had built could absorb every dead patient and still emerge confirming itself. The wound was packed. The ointment was applied. The surgeon went home. The patient, in 3 or 4 days, did not. But there was one part of the surgical experience the medieval world had tried, briefly and imperfectly, to soften. Not the cut, not the infection, the moment in between. The moment when the patient was still awake, still aware, still able to feel everything that was about to happen. Because somewhere in the monastic libraries of medieval Europe there were recipes for a cup the patient drank before the surgeon picked up the knife, a cup that was supposed to send him into a sleep he would not remember when he woke, a cup that with the wrong measure would send him into a sleep he would not wake from at all.
The cup was small, wooden usually, sometimes pewter in the wealthier households, sometimes a simple clay bowl, glazed on the inside, set down on the chair where the patient was about to sit. The surgeon would not pour it himself. That was the apothecary's job, or the monk's, or the wife's. Whoever had made it carefully, measuring the ingredients with a small bone spoon, holding the spoon up to the candlelight to check the level, knowing that too much of the wrong thing meant a patient who never woke, and too little meant a patient who felt every second of what was about to happen. The cup had a name in medieval England. It was called Dwale. The word survives in Middle English manuscripts from the 14th century, and the recipes survive with it, written down in surgical handbooks, in monastic herbals, in the margins of books that were used by men who actually had to make the thing and use it on a patient who was watching them measure. It was not anesthesia in the modern sense. The medieval mind had no concept of a controlled, reversible loss of consciousness. The cup was something stranger and more frightening than that. It was a sedative, a hallucinogen, an analgesic, and a poison all at the same time, in proportions that the apothecary judged by experience and the patient drank by faith. It was, in the most literal possible sense, a leap. The recipes varied across the medieval world, but the core ingredients were remarkably consistent. The standard English Dwale, recorded in a 14th century manuscript now held at the British Library, called for the gall of a boar, the juice of hemlock, the juice of wild bryony, lettuce juice, opium poppy, henbane, and vinegar. 3 spoonfuls of each, mixed in a measure of wine, and given to the patient to drink while he sat. He would, the manuscript promised, fall asleep so deeply that the surgeon could safely cut, burn, saw, or do whatever the operation required. To wake him afterward, the surgeon was instructed to wash his face and temples with vinegar and salt. That was the recipe, that was the procedure, and every single one of those ingredients in modern pharmacology is now classified as a controlled substance, a deliriant, or an outright poison.
Hemlock, the same plant that killed Socrates in 399 BC, is a powerful neurotoxin. Henbane is a deliriant capable of causing terrifying hallucinations and, in higher doses, respiratory failure. Mandrake, which appeared in the Mediterranean and continental versions of the recipe, contains scopolamine and atropine, both of which can stop a heart at the wrong dose. Opium, of course, is opium. Bryony is a violent purgative. The combination, mixed in proportions that no two medieval apothecaries agreed on, was being administered to patients who were already physically weakened by the conditions that had brought them to the surgeon in the first place. A few of them died from the cup before the knife ever touched them. Most of them did not. That was the margin. That was the gamble. That was the sleep that wasn't sleep. There was an older form of the same idea, used across the Mediterranean from late antiquity through the High Middle Ages, called the spongia somnifera, the soporific sponge. The technique had been refined in the Salernitan medical school in southern Italy in the 11th and 12th centuries, and described in detail by Theodoric of Cervia himself, the same surgeon we met in the last chapter, the one whose advice on clean wounds was ignored. The sponge was soaked in a solution of opium, mandrake, hemlock, mulberry juice, ivy seeds, and several other ingredients, then dried slowly in the sun until the active compounds had crystallized into the fibers of the sponge itself. To use it, the surgeon rehydrated the sponge with hot water and held it under the patient's nose. The patient breathed, the patient drifted. The patient, if the dose was right, slipped into a deep enough state that the surgery could begin. To wake the patient afterward, the surgeon held a different sponge, soaked in vinegar, under the nose, and the sharpness of the smell was supposed to bring them back. Sometimes it did, sometimes it did not, and the patient was buried with the surgery half completed. The Arab physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, described similar techniques in the Canon of Medicine, completed around 1025, which became one of the most influential medical texts of the medieval European world. His descriptions of inhalational anesthesia were precise, careful, and clearly drawn from practical use. The Islamic medical tradition was, on the question of pain control, several hundred years ahead of Christian Europe. The knowledge moved westward slowly through the translation centers of Toledo and Salerno and reached the surgeons of France and England in fragments. The trouble was the dose. Plant potency varied wildly. A mandrake root grown in Sicily was not the same as one grown in Provence. A hemlock plant harvested in spring was not the same as one harvested in autumn. The opium poppy gave different yields depending on rainfall, soil, and the moment in the day the latex was collected. There was no chemistry to standardize any of it. There was only the apothecary's experience, the surgeon's judgment, and the patient's body, which would respond to the same recipe with sleep one day and with death the next. And so the medieval surgeon, faced with this terrifying margin, often did not use the cup at all. Many surgeries were performed entirely without anesthesia, simply because the surgeon judged that the patient had a better chance of surviving the operation awake than of surviving the drink. The leather strap to bite on, the wine to dull the edges, the 4 men to hold the body still, these were the everyday tools.
The Dwale, the sponge, the cup of mandrake, these were the special occasions. They were used. They were not used often. The knowledge faded. The Salernitan school declined. The recipes were copied less. By the early modern period, much of medieval anesthesia had become folklore, half remembered, half feared, attributed to witches and wise women, increasingly suspect to the rising university-trained physicians who preferred the certainty of bloodletting over the witchcraft of mandrake. Some of the recipes were preserved in monastic libraries. Some were lost when the monasteries were dissolved in the 16th century. Some were burned, along with the women who had inherited them. When William Morton, an American dentist, publicly demonstrated the use of ether for surgical anesthesia at Massachusetts General Hospital on October 16, 1846, the medical world greeted the moment as the invention of something that had never existed before. It was not. It was the rediscovery of an idea the medieval world held, imperfectly, in its hand for 500 years, and then let fall. From today's view, the Dwale and the sponge look like reckless experiments, folk remedies dressed up as medicine, dosed by guess, killing as often as they soothed. From their view, they were a careful and frightening attempt to do the most humane thing the era could imagine, to send the patient somewhere else, even briefly, while the worst was being done to his body. And that, too, is what's so chilling. Not that the medieval world had no anesthesia, that it had it and forgot it, and waited 500 years to remember.
The cup is empty. The patient's eyes are closed. The surgeon picks up his knife. The candle flickers once, and the room goes very still. But not every surgical horror in the medieval world began with the patient's consent. There was one operation that no one ever drank a cup for. One operation the patient was never expected to survive, because she was already gone before the knife came out at all. Wait, that's the next chapter. Let me hand it off cleanly first. For now, the cup is empty, the candle is steady, and whatever the Dwale was, recipe, gamble, sleep, poison, it was the only mercy the surgeon had to offer, and he offered it knowing the cost.
The young man had not slept. He had been working for nearly 2 days without rest, and his hands were shaking, and the wounded were still arriving, and the small clay jar of elder oil on his table, the jar he was supposed to be heating, the jar he was supposed to be pouring into every gunshot wound that came through the tent, was empty. He had used it all. He stared at the empty jar for a long moment. Outside, the cannons were still firing somewhere over the next ridge. Inside, 15, maybe 20 men were waiting for him to do the only thing that medieval and early modern military medicine knew how to do for a gunshot wound: pour scalding oil into it. The doctrine was firm. Gunpowder, the surgeons of the era believed, was a poison. Any wound made by a firearm carried that poison into the body, and the only way to neutralize it was heat, boiling oil, applied directly into the wound, deep enough to reach the bottom of the channel the bullet had carved. The patients screamed. They always screamed. A few of them died from the shock of the oil before the wound itself had a chance to kill them. The rest spent the night with burns layered on top of bullet holes, and in the morning the surgeon would change their dressings and prepare to do it again, because the alternative, not pouring the oil, meant the patient would die of poisoning within days. That was the doctrine. That was what every surgical manual taught.
That was what the young Frenchman in the tent had been trained to do, and what he had been doing for nearly 2 days, until the jar ran out. His name was Ambroise Paré. He was 26 years old. The year was 1537. The siege was at the castle of Vilaine in the Piedmont campaign, part of the long Italian wars between France and the Holy Roman Empire. He had begun his career, as we mentioned in Chapter 6, sweeping the floor of a barber-surgeon's shop in Laval. He had moved up to apprentice. He had moved up to qualified barber-surgeon. He had then, somewhat against the customary path, signed on as a military surgeon for the French army. And now, in this tent, with no oil left and a line of men waiting, he was facing the first real crossroads of his professional life.
He could not turn the men away. He could not pour what he did not have. So he did what every surgeon in history has done when the standard treatment is unavailable. He improvised. He reached for the materials he did have. He mixed a salve, egg yolks, rose oil, and turpentine, and he applied them gently to the gunshot wounds, packed them with linen, and bandaged them. He did this for every remaining patient that night. He did not boil anything. He did not pour anything scalding. He simply cleaned the wounds as best he could, applied his improvised salve, and went to bed expecting the worst. He did not sleep. He has written about this himself in the autobiographical preface to one of his later works, and the passage is one of the most quietly moving documents in the history of medicine. He lay awake all night, he says, fearing that he would find the men dead in the morning, poisoned by the gunpowder he had failed to neutralize, killed by his own incompetence and his own empty jar. He rose before dawn. He went to the tent. He pulled back the dressings. The men who had received the salve were resting comfortably. Their wounds were warm, but not hot. They were not feverish. They were not in agony. They were, by every visible sign, doing better than the men he had treated with boiling oil the day before, who were, even now, lying in their cots in burned, suppurating misery, fevered, swollen, some of them already sliding toward death. Paré stood in the tent and understood in a single morning that everything he had been taught was wrong. He wrote it down. He wrote it down carefully, and then in the years that followed, he wrote it down again and again in book after book, building a case that the orthodox treatment of gunshot wounds was actively killing the patients it was supposed to save. He published his major surgical work, La méthode de traiter les plaies faites par arquebuses et autres bastons à feu, the method of treating wounds made by harquebuses and other firearms, in 1545, 8 years after the night the oil ran out. He was 35 years old. The book changed European military surgery.
It changed it slowly. Of course it changed it slowly. The orthodox surgeons of the day, the ones who had built careers and reputations on the boiling oil doctrine, did not surrender quickly. Paré was a barber-surgeon by training, not a university physician, and the educated medical class regarded him with the same suspicion they had always reserved for men who came up through the trade. They argued, they wrote rebuttals, they insisted that the gunpowder poison was real, that Paré's results were anecdotal, that his improvised salve was a folk remedy rather than a method. The argument took decades. Paré kept working. He served as the personal surgeon for 4 kings of France, Henry II, Francis II, Charles II, and Henry III, across a career that spanned almost 50 years. He performed amputations. He invented new surgical tools, including a refined version of the screw tongs that John Bradmore had used 130 years earlier on Prince Hal.
He pioneered the use of ligatures, tying off blood vessels with thread, instead of cauterizing them with hot iron, which reduced blood loss, reduced burns, and dramatically improved survival rates from amputation. And he wrote, throughout his life, the single phrase that has come to stand for everything he was. Je l'ai pensé, Dieu le guérit. I dressed his wound, God healed him. It is carved on his tomb. It is the humblest sentence in the history of surgery, and it was written by a man who had personally changed the field more than anyone else of his century.
He saved the life of King Charles IX during the night of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, sheltering him inside the royal apartments while Protestant nobles were being murdered in the streets of Paris. Paré himself was a Huguenot, a French Protestant, and the king is said to have personally protected him through the night, returning the favor of all the wounds Paré had ever dressed for him. He died in 1590 at the age of 79. The boiling oil doctrine outlived him in some quarters by another 50 years, but it was by then a doctrine on retreat, increasingly defended only by the surgeons who had never been to a battlefield and never seen the difference Paré had seen on the morning the jar ran out. From today's view, Paré's discovery looks like obvious common sense. Of course, you don't pour scalding oil into an open wound. From their view, he was overturning 1,400 years of orthodoxy on the basis of a single sleepless night and a salve he had improvised because he had no other choice. And that, too, is what's so chilling. Not the discovery itself, that medicine had been killing patients with the same wrong answer for so long that the right answer, when it finally arrived, looked like heresy. The empty jar, the improvised salve, the morning the men were still alive. That was the night European surgery began to change. But there was one operation Paré could not save anyone from. One operation no surgeon of his century could perform on a living mother and have her live. The patient was already dying when the knife came out, and the knife came out, almost always, only because there was a child still inside. The room was full of women. That was the first thing a man entering it would have noticed, and a man almost never entered it. Childbirth in medieval Europe was a women's event, presided over by a midwife, attended by the mother's female relatives, lit by candles and warmed by a low fire, conducted in a closed chamber that men were politely and firmly excluded from. The midwife had been doing this for years. She had her hands, she had her oils, she had the herbs that brought on labor and the herbs that slowed it. She had the prayers she said quietly over the bed, and the prayers she said louder when something began to go wrong. When something went wrong badly enough, the door opened. The priest came in first, the surgeon came second, and the women who had been holding the room together stepped back against the walls and waited for the worst sentence the medieval world could pronounce on a labor, that the mother was already dying and that the child still inside her was now the only life that could be saved. The procedure had a name. It had several names depending on the century and the language. In Latin, it was partus Caesaris, the cut birth. In English, by the late medieval period, it was simply called the cut, or the surgeon's birth, or, in the bluntest of the parish records, taken from the dead mother. The modern name, the Caesarean section, has a folk origin attached to it, the legend that Julius Caesar himself had been born this way. The legend is almost certainly false. Caesar's mother, Aurelia, lived for decades after his birth, and no woman in the Roman world survived an abdominal delivery in the 1st century B.C. The procedure that bears Caesar's name was named not for him, but for the Roman legal code that required it, the Lex Regia,
attributed to the 8th century BC king Numa Pompilius, which forbade the burial of a pregnant woman until the child had been removed from her body. The law was later codified under the Lex Caesarea under the early Roman emperors. The name stuck. The misunderstanding followed it across 2,000 years. The medieval church inherited the Roman law and gave it religious force. A child who died in the womb, unbaptized, was believed to be condemned to limbo for eternity. A child removed from a dying mother and baptized before its own death, even if it lived only seconds, was saved. The mathematics of medieval theology were severe. The mother, already lost, could be granted last rites. The child, still living inside her, could be granted a soul's eternity. The knife was, in this calculation, a sacrament.
And so the surgeon was called. Not to save the mother was past saving. The bleeding had been too long, or the labor had stopped, or the fever had already crossed the threshold from which medieval medicine knew no return. He was called for the child. He was called almost always when the mother had hours or minutes left, and sometimes when she had already died and the child's movements inside her could still be felt by a hand laid carefully on the belly. The procedure was simple, in the brutal way that medieval surgery was often simple. A single long incision down the side of the abdomen, through the skin, through the muscle, through the wall of the uterus. The child was lifted out, the cord was cut, the child was handed immediately to the priest, who baptized it with whatever water was at hand, sometimes wine if water had not been prepared. If the child was alive, it was given to a wet nurse. If the child was dead, it was wrapped in cloth and laid beside its mother for burial. The mother, in almost every case, did not survive. The combination of blood loss, shock, and the absence of any technique to close a uterine incision meant that even in the rare cases where she had still been alive when the surgeon began, she was almost never alive when he finished. The medieval Caesarean was, by design and by outcome, a post-mortem operation in nearly every recorded instance. The exceptions were so rare that they entered folklore. The most famous of those exceptions belongs to a Swiss sow-gelder named Jacob Neuffer, who, around the year 1500, reportedly performed a Caesarean section on his own wife after she had been in obstructed labor for 3 days and 13 midwives had failed to deliver the child. Neuffer, whose profession involved cutting open pregnant pigs, applied what he knew. He made the incision, he delivered the child, he sewed his wife back together. According to the account, first written down 60 years after the fact by a French surgeon named François Rousset, both mother and child survived. The wife went on to bear 5 more children, including a set of twins by ordinary delivery. The story has been doubted by historians for the better part of 400 years, and it cannot be verified from contemporary records. But it has survived because it was, for centuries, the only such story, the exception that proved the rule.
Rousset published his treatise Nouveau Traité de l'Hystérotomotochie in 1581, advocating for the Caesarean to be performed on living mothers as a deliberate medical intervention, rather than only on dying ones. The medical establishment rejected him. The procedure remained for the next 300 years what it had always been, a final mercy for the unborn, performed on the body of a woman the surgeon had already been told he could not save. The first reliably documented Caesarean in which both mother and child survived in the modern sense did not occur until the 19th century, after the development of antisepsis, anesthesia, and uterine suturing. James Miranda Barry, the Irish-born military surgeon who lived their entire professional life as a man and who was discovered after death to have been assigned female at birth, is credited with one of the earliest such successful operations in South Africa around 1826 on a woman named Wilhelmina Munich,
whose son lived to be named James Barry Munich in the surgeon's honor. The grandchild of that child would later become James Barry Munich Herzog, Prime Minister of South Africa. A single Caesarean in 1826 produced 3 generations later a head of state. But that was 3 centuries after the medieval period ended. For the medieval surgeon called into the candlelit room with the women stepped back against the walls and the priest waiting with the water and the mother no longer responding to her own name, the procedure was never about saving 2 lives. It was about saving 1. And the one being saved had not yet drawn its first breath. From today's view, the medieval Caesarean looks like a horror, a knife taken to a dying woman so that an infant might live a few minutes longer in baptized grace. From their view, it was the most loving thing the surgeon could do in the moment they had been given. The mother was already crossing. The child was the bridge. The cut was the only way the bridge could be walked. And that, too, is what's so chilling, not the operation, that the medieval world had built around the worst hour of a woman's life a theology that turned the surgeon's knife into an act of mercy, and the mother, in the end, into the cost. The candle gutters. The priest folds his stole. The midwife begins the long, quiet work of preparing the body. The surgeon wipes the blade and steps back into the corridor where the husband is waiting, and where there is no longer any version of the news the surgeon can give him that does not begin with the word "but." There was one place in the medieval world, however, where surgery was not performed in candlelit rooms by men called in at the worst possible hour. One place where medicine was practiced quietly, daily, by hands that had been trained in libraries and by minds that had read the Greeks and the Arabs and written commentaries of their own. One place where, against the assumptions of the age, the most influential medical voice was a woman. The room smelled of herbs. That was the first thing. Before the light, before the quiet, before the soft sound of a wooden spoon stirring something warm in a clay pot at the far end of the hall. It smelled of rosemary and thyme, of crushed lavender, of fennel and sage, of the warm, sweet undertone of honey kept in jars on the high shelves. It smelled, in other words, like a kitchen, not like a sick room, not like a tent, not like a barber shop with its bowl of leeches by the window. The medieval monastic infirmarium smelled like a place where someone had been cooking, slowly, for a very long time, for someone they cared about. This was the infirmarium, the hospital of the monastery. It existed in nearly every Benedictine, Cistercian, and Augustinian house in Europe from the 7th century onward, and for most of the medieval period, it was the closest thing the Western world had to what we would now recognize as an actual hospital. Beds in rows, clean linen washed regularly, a garden of medicinal herbs tended by the brothers or the sisters of the house, a small library of medical books, often copied by hand from older texts and shelved beside the prayer books, a schedule, a discipline, a quiet. Patients were admitted regardless of payment. Travelers were received. The dying were given a bed and not turned away. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, had stated the principle in plain words. The care of the sick is to be placed above and before every other duty. The monasteries took the instruction seriously. For nearly 1,000 years, the infirmarium was the bed the medieval poor could lie in when there was nowhere else. The medicine practiced inside it was not the medicine of the battlefield. There were no amputations here, or almost none. There were no trepanations. There were no lithotomies performed in the courtyard. The monastic infirmarian was not a surgeon, After the Council of Tours in 1163, the Church had forbidden the clergy from shedding blood, and the monasteries had quietly handed the cutting work outward to the barber-surgeons in the towns. What remained inside the monastery walls was the older, gentler half of medicine: diet, rest, herbo-preparation, the careful observation of symptoms over days and weeks, the quiet ministering to a body that had been damaged by something the world had done to it.
And in one of those monasteries in the Rhineland in the 12th century, a woman was working who would write some of the most influential medical books of the entire medieval period. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen. She had been born in 1098, the 10th child of a noble German family, and given to a Benedictine community at the age of 8 as an oblate, a child dedicated to monastic life. She grew up inside the walls. She took her vows. She rose slowly through the ranks of the women's community attached to the monastery of Disibodenberg, and in 1136 she was elected magistra, the leader of the women, at the age of 38. 12 years later, she founded her own monastery at the Rupertsberg, near the town of Bingen on the Rhine, and it was there that she did most of her writing. She wrote a great deal: theology, music, some of the most beautiful liturgical music to survive from the entire Middle Ages bears her name, letters to popes and emperors and abbots in which she gave advice that was generally taken seriously and occasionally taken poorly. She wrote visionary texts, the most famous of which, the Scivias, recorded the spiritual visions she had experienced since childhood. And she wrote 2 medical books that would shape monastic medicine for centuries afterward. The first was the Physica, completed around 1158, a long, careful, almost encyclopedic catalogue of the natural world, organized by category: plants, stones, trees, fish, birds, animals, metals. Each entry described the substance, its properties, its medicinal uses, the conditions it could treat, the way it should be prepared. Hildegard had walked the gardens of her own monastery. She had spoken with the infirmarians. She had read what she could find of Galen and the older authorities, and she had supplemented their advice with the practical, hands-on knowledge of the women who had been growing, drying, and brewing these herbs for generations before she put them on the page. The second book was the Causes and Curae, Causes and Cures, a more clinical work, organized by disease rather than by ingredient. It described the conditions a monastic infirmary was likely to encounter and the treatments Hildegard had found most effective for each. It addressed digestion, sleep, fever, headache, women's health, melancholy, and the long, quiet exhaustions of monastic life that no battlefield surgeon would ever have been called to treat. It was practical. It was specific. It was, in many places, demonstrably effective. A number of the herbal preparations she described have been studied in modern times and found to contain genuinely active compounds. The central concept that ran through all of Hildegard's medical writings was a word she used so often it became almost a signature: viriditas. The Latin literally means greenness, but in Hildegard's hands it expanded into something larger, a kind of life force, the green, vital energy that ran through plants and bodies and the world itself, the visible sign that something was alive and could still be healed. Sickness, in Hildegard's framework, was a loss of viriditas. Healing was the restoration of it. The work of the infirmary was not to fight an enemy. It was to coax the green back into a body that had begun to wither. It is a gentler vision of medicine than almost anything else the medieval world produced. It does not involve cutting. It does not involve burning. It does not involve the screaming of a patient held down by 4 men.
It involves a garden, a kitchen, a quiet room, a wooden spoon, and the slow, patient attention of someone who believes that the body knows how to heal if it is given the conditions to do so. She died in 1179 at the age of 81. Her monastery survived her for several centuries before being dissolved during the 30 Years' War. Her books were copied, read, copied again, and in some quarters quietly forgotten. The rising universities of the late medieval period preferred their medicine in Latin commentaries on Aristotle, not in herbal catalogues by a Rhineland abbess. She was canonized as a saint in 2012, more than 800 years after her death, and named a Doctor of the Church the same year, only the fourth woman in history to receive that title. Her name, today, is one of the most searched terms in the history of medieval medicine. Her music is performed regularly. Her medical writings are studied. Her viriditas, that green, vital, patient idea of healing, has outlived almost every doctrine of the surgeons and physicians who were taken more seriously in her own century. From today's view, Hildegard of Bingen looks like a kind of vindication. The gentler medicine, the patient observation, the respect for the body's own ability to heal. From their view, she was a magistra, the leader of a small community of women in a monastery on the Rhine, who tended the sick because the rule of Saint Benedict said it was the most important thing they could do, and who, in the slow, careful work of doing it, wrote down enough of what she learned that her books survived to be read by people who would never see the garden where the herbs had grown.
And that, too, is what's so beautiful. Not chilling, beautiful. Because for all the horror this video has spent 2 hours walking through, the drill and the saw, the boiling oil and the laudable pus, the patient sitting upright and watching the needle, the candlelit room and the knife taken out for the child. There was, at the same time, a quiet hospital somewhere in the Rhineland, a garden, a spoon stirring something warm in a pot, a woman writing carefully in Latin by candlelight, recording what she had learned about how the green comes back into a body. The medieval world held both of these things at once, the horror and the herb, the amputation and the viriditas, the barber's bowl and the abbess's garden. History is rarely only one thing. The candle burns lower now. The room grows quieter. The herbs on the high shelves settle into their jars. Somewhere a wooden spoon has stopped stirring, and the warm pot has been lifted off the fire, and the long, slow work of the day is finished. Sleep well. We'll meet again, somewhere darker, on another quiet night.